The discussion around climate change is no longer if climate is going to change, but how much. Are we going to wind up at the top of the projections, or are we going to actually be able to reduce emissions to a level that puts us down at the lower end? What we know is that the option of no warming in the 21st century is not an option. Right? We will see change. Even if we stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, we will continue to see change because of lags in the Earth's climate system, the ocean, the way that the ocean absorbs heat, for example. What you're also going to hear about today and tomorrow is how climate change affects many aspects of human and natural systems. From our hydropower production and our ability to manage flows for both hydropower production and for salmon. It influences where we live, our houses, how we build them. Where we build them. It influences decisions about managing floods. It influences water supply. All of these are infrastructure, what it needs to withstand. It influences forest health, how and where we grow food. All of these aspects are affected by climate because they either directly or indirectly have assumptions about climate embedded in these decisions. So one of the things that's very clear and will become clearer is that the future ain't what it used to be, right? We can subtitle this talk, What Yogi Berra Taught Me About Climate Change. And we have choices that we need to make. So what are our choices for dealing with this not so new reality? And I call it the not so new reality because we've known about this problem for a very long time. It seems like the science of climate change is new, but in reality, our first understandings of how greenhouse gases moderate the Earth's climate system were established back in the 1850s. And the first calculations of how changes in the concentration of greenhouse gases would affect average global temperature were made in 1896. So this is not new. So we're a bit behind. So what are our options? Well, one is to assume that climate change is not happening, or we can deny it. This is a well-trodden path. We've done that fairly well for a long time. We can wait until the science is completely resolved, all the uncertainties, so that we know what we're dealing with exactly and precisely, and then we can act. Do you know what this is in reference to? Waiting for Godot, right. Does Godot ever arrive? Many of these uncertainties are irreducible. We can better bound them, but we don't have the ability to perfectly predict the future. So that's not really an option. We can put all of our efforts into reducing greenhouse gases, a laudable effort. That's what we know as mitigation. We can put all of our efforts into preparing for climate change impacts. This is what's known as adaptation. This is a tide gate or floodgate in the Netherlands. After Superstorm Sandy, the projected cost for building a gate similar to this, maybe not looking exactly like this, but a similar concept, was $17 billion. So these are not inexpensive pieces of infrastructure. And another option that has been kind of out there is geoengineering, which is basically manipulating the Earth's atmosphere to try to offset the warming. And this is a particular figure showing the idea of loading sulfur dioxide into aircraft, whether that be converted 747s, military fighters, or large balloons, and sending that up into the stratosphere because sulfur dioxide will buffer temperatures. Call me crazy, but somehow I think that there might be some unintended consequences in this course of action. Call it a hunch. So what single option is correct? Here's the pop quiz. What's the key word there? Single, you know it's a trick question. Technically, none of them are. And what we do know now is that we need to both mitigate and adapt. And the reason why I put this slide in here is that for a long time, these two words were not allowed to be said synonymously. Adaptation was a bad word because if you talked about adaptation, it somehow inferred that we were giving up on dealing with mitigation, that we were throwing in the towel and just saying, okay, we'll just adapt our way out of this. But what's happened over the last 15 years or so is it's become very obvious that, number one, we are not going to avoid impacts of climate change. It's a question now, what is the scale of those impacts? So we have to adapt, but we also know that we have to mitigate because if we don't, we could really wind up with a climate system that seriously challenges life as we know it. And I'm not talking, end of humanity, but I'm just talking about the serious, fundamental, critical changes in the Earth's climate system that really affect food production and population dynamics and migration patterns of people and world politics, geopolitics. It gets kind of crazy. So we know we need to do both. And now people are talking about both. The other thing that's happening is that people used to talk about mitigation and adaptation separately, and actually we're seeing that those conversations are merging together, and I think that's really exciting too. And that people are recognizing that many adaptation options have mitigation benefits, and many mitigation actions have adaptation benefits. And this building is a great example of that. There is obviously huge energy savings, as Dennis Hayes highlighted in his opening comments, but those also have adaptation benefits because with enough of these buildings, maybe we don't have to then go buy on the spot market and purchase coal-powered energy produced in other parts of the country to fill the energy gap. And we don't have to maybe build another dam. So there are some great adaptive benefits to this building. The stormwater management, right? We know we have problems with stormwater management. When we build structures that are able to better manage the stormwater, we are saving energy because we're not sending stormwater to the wastewater treatment system to be treated. And we're also reducing problems with stormwater runoff and the associated problems with that. So again, there's a lot of co-benefits in these actions. And this is just a figure showing some of that. So when we talk about adapting to climate change, we are not saying that we stop mitigating. They have to happen hand in hand. But so what are the goals of adaptation? Well, the key goal is essentially to moderate the harm, right? Reduce the impacts of climate change, and that is done by preparing for the impacts that we are expecting and building up your ability to react well when they occur and also react well to the things we can anticipate. And this involves both short-term coping strategies and long-term, deeper transformational change or systemic change in how we do things that are affected by climate. This is a picture from Superstorm Sandy. A key concept that you're going to hear a lot, I even used it at the beginning, is the term resilience. It is the word du jour, but I think it is very appropriate when we talk about adaptation that we're talking about building up the capacity to withstand the shocks that come with climate and to bounce back from that. We may not be able to bounce back to the same state, but we are able to bounce back to some desired goal. It may, in terms, for example, species rehabilitation or species recovery, right? We may not be able to recover a species in that particular space, but a resilient species is one that we can recover maybe in a new location because of climate change. Maybe we move those efforts into an area that's going to be more suitable. There are lots of definitions here for resilience, but we all know what a resilient resilient health is, right? You can get the flu and bounce back and get back to work and you're in good shape. So it's a similar concept. It's a very common concept. So adaptive planning asks organizations, institutions, that's where a lot of the effort is right now, but even individuals, can we achieve our goals in a changing climate? Oftentimes the question may be yes, but sometimes it may be no, but the key is asking that question. And how do we protect our investments in a changing climate? What do we need to do to reduce the risks associated with climate change? How do we avoid creating new risks? I've been working on a project with Sound Transit looking at how climate change could affect Sound Transit's different modes, and this is a big thing as they expand their system. They would want to be asking, how do we avoid putting transit services in areas that may be affected by climate change in ways that would interfere with service delivery? Right? And then what opportunities should we prepare for? Because there will be some opportunities. It's not always negative. And there may be, for example, in the agricultural sector, new types of crops that could be grown in the region that may actually be a good replacement for some of the other types of crops that may become more difficult to grow. There may be great cost savings, actually. That would be an opportunity that can come from some of these adaptive actions. There are lots of aspects of adaptation, and certainly adaptive actions will depend on, it will vary by location, and Hetty is going to talk about some of the things that Washington's doing. Michelle's going to talk about things that Portland is doing, so you'll get a sense of what's happening in terms of adaptation locally. But one of the key things, kind of the underlying characteristics of adaptation, is that it's not a one and done kind of activity. You don't develop your adaptation plan and say, good, we've adapted, and put it on the shelf and go off and forget about it. Our climate is going to be continuing to change. Our understanding of those changes is going to continue to evolve. And the systems within which we work, our communities, our social values, those all change. A great example is look at where salmon were on the radar 50 years ago. Nobody really cared about salmon except for the tribal communities. But now, salmon drives so many decisions. So these things change over time. And with that, we need to be regularly reevaluating those questions I had before. Can we reach our goals? What do we know about the science now? Have our past assumptions about climate change, and the decisions we've made based on those still hold true? Ideally, adaptation is proactive. Some parts of it will be reactive. We can't predict everything. If we don't do any adaptation planning, it's all going to be reactive. And then we may not wind up with the best decisions or even good decisions. Adaptation occurs it's not an isolated activity. These adaptation decisions have to be made in the context of lots of other things that are happening within a community. And that means that sometimes what seems like the obvious path is not always going to be easy to follow and to get there. So it takes a lot of time. And it will not always be successful. We are going to make mistakes. We are going to make mistakes because of surprises in the climate system, or just because we are trying new technologies, we're trying new infrastructure designs. So we have to allow some latitude for that. We also have to watch out for maladaptation, which is going in the wrong direction. So generally, the process of adaptation involves defining the problem. That's looking at the climate projections for the Pacific Northwest and asking, what does this mean for what I do within my organization? It involves identifying, assessing options for addressing any climate risks. It involves implementing, monitoring to figure out how the adaptation actions are working over time and whether they're achieving what is intended, and evaluating the results of that monitoring and adapting those decisions. If it's not working, if you're not getting the results that you need, then we need to adjust. And it's a loop because, as I've mentioned, this is an ongoing process. And this is really hard to do, and especially in the public sector. Typically, we make the decision and then we're on to other things. And it's this part of the loop that can become very difficult to follow through with. Adaptation can happen through formal planning processes. This is the state strategy. The Swinomish Indian tribal community has an adaptation plan, and this is probably what most people are familiar with when we see adaptation planning. People will get together, stakeholder groups will get together, they'll develop the plan. And we're really good at developing plans. The real devil in the details, or the real challenge then, is implementing those ideas. But I also want to note that adaptation planning can happen informally, right? What do we all know this means? Just do it, right? Yeah, it's just do it. So there's a lot of adaptation planning that is happening outside the formal planning structure, where you get individual programs that are essentially doing adaptive evaluations and making adaptive decisions without having this overarching superstructure of an adaptation plan. So it's happening at multiple levels. Generally, right now, most of the activity is in defining the problem and identifying and assessing options. This is essentially writing the adaptation plan. Some communities are starting to get into implementation, and there's essentially no monitoring and evaluation that's being done yet. So you're going to see, and this is to be expected, a lot of activity and a lot of rapid activity, because it's really easy to get groups together and talk about the problems and talk about generally what you want to do to fix those problems. It's the implementation where we really start to slow down and where the real hard work of adaptation actually starts. In 2007, this shows you what was going on with adaptation planning. We had about 11 states that either had adaptation plans in progress or were recommending adaptation action plans. In 2013, you can see that there's much more activity happening at this level. And this is a map that they're continuing to update. There are now 15 states that have completed adaptation plans, 4 more in progress, and several others that are recommending it. Here's some examples of what's happening in Washington State. These are communities that have developed plans or are involved in adaptation planning. This is by no means a complete list. And there are reports and details on each of these. I didn't want to go through all of those, but just to show you that there's a lot happening. A key task for adaptation planning is what we call mainstreaming. So adaptation does not happen in isolation of all these other decisions, so it's really important that as decisions are made about salmon recovery and watershed planning and habitat conservation and water supply, that you're asking, how does climate change affect these things? And in the media, as a reporter, these are also good places to be asking. Have you thought about what climate change means for this dike that's being installed? Have you did the planning process here take into account climate change impacts and how this affects things? As I mentioned earlier, this mainstreaming is really important because assumptions are embedded in all of these decisions, assumptions about climate. And I'll close with just an example. Back in 2002, I did some research on the Department of Ecology's Watershed Planning program. These are groups of volunteers who get together to tackle some of the tough issues in their watersheds. There was 4 years of funding to provide that activity. I asked what were the reasons why these groups got together to go through this 4-year process. And I know it's hard for some of you to see, but there's a long list of issues from endangered species and in-stream flows to groundwater use, water rights allocations, growth within the basin, et cetera. Lots of issues. Climate change affects every one of those. There's an element of climate, and climate change will affect the in-stream flows. Climate change will affect growth within a watershed, right? Because if it starts affecting the economy and et cetera. So a long list of ways that climate change affects each one of these issues that brought people to the table. There are lots of resources. This will be here. You're going to have copies of the presentation, so just lots of resources I want to point out. As I mentioned, please feel free to call me. We have lots of data for planners and people who are actually working on adaptation. So we are not without data in this region, I can tell you that. We have a lot of really good, rich information about regional and local climate impacts. So my concluding points are that the awareness of the need for adaptation planning is growing rapidly, and more adaptation planning is occurring. However, there's not enough adaptation planning going on. I feel very confident about that. We need much, much more. The effectiveness of those efforts is unknown, and we may not know for some time. And the willingness for what we call transformational change. Really, some of these impacts will require really different thinking and approaches to how we do things. For example, how we use the coastline. That is not clear if we're ready for that. A lot of the change has been kind of on the margins, which is to be expected. And the basis for that deep transformational change may only come as climate change becomes more obvious. It may have to be staring more people in the face before they're willing to do that, but it may unfortunately have to get to that point, but call anytime. My contact information is there. So that's the macro level view on adaptation.